A forestry surveyor walks into a stretch of woodland in rural Brandenburg, Germany. Routine job, mapping root systems, checking soil erosion. He's done it 1,000 times. But this time, his ground-penetrating radar picks up something that shouldn't be there. Straight lines, geometric shapes, concrete buried beneath 80 years of undergrowth. He starts digging, and what comes out of that forest floor will rewrite the final chapter of World War II. Rusted iron reinforced walls, a collapsed bunker entrance swallowed by roots and moss. Inside a cot, a desk, stacks of mildewed books and personal effects belonging to a high-ranking Wehrmacht general, a man who officially vanished in the chaos of April 1945. No body was ever recovered, no grave was ever found. The Soviets couldn't find him. The Americans couldn't find him. His own family searched for decades and got nothing but silence for 80 years. No one knew where General Karl Friedrich Brandt went. They assumed he died in the final battle for Berlin, blown apart by artillery, or buried in an unmarked pit, like so many others. But he wasn't on any battlefield. He wasn't in any mass grave. He was right here, less than 60 miles from where he was last seen alive, hidden in a compound he built with his own hands, waiting out the end of a war he no longer believed in. For 80 years, no one knew where he went. Now we know he never left. To understand what was found in that forest, you need to understand the man who built it. Karl Friedrich Brandt was born in 1896 into a respected Prussian military family, the kind of household where duty wasn't taught, it was inherited. His father served in the Franco-Prussian War, his grandfather before him. By the time Karl Friedrich was 18, he was already in the trenches of World War I, a young officer decorated twice before his 20th birthday. Between the wars, he rose quietly through the ranks, not through politics or party loyalty, but through competence. He was a tactician, a planner, the kind of officer other officers respected, because he never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself when the Second World War broke out. Brandt commanded divisions on the Eastern Front, some of the most brutal fighting in human history. His men followed him not because they had to, but because he had a reputation. He brought people home, but here's what made Brandt different from so many others. He was never a true believer. He served the machine, but privately he questioned it. His field journals, recovered decades later, contained not just tactical notes, but poetry, reflections on loss and fatherhood. He had 3 children back home, a wife who wrote him letters every week. He carried their photographs in a leather wallet that never left his chest pocket. By late 1944, Brandt was stationed near Berlin, and the man who had spent his life following orders was watching the Reich collapse around him. The Eastern Front was crumbling, the Western Allies were pushing in, and the orders coming down from high command had stopped making sense. He was being told to defend positions with divisions that existed only on paper. Old men and teenage boys handed rifles and told to hold the line against the entire Soviet army. Brandt knew the math, and the math said it was over. By April 1945, Germany wasn't a country anymore. It was a corpse that hadn't stopped moving. The Soviet army was closing in from the east, a massive, unstoppable wave of armor and artillery, rolling toward Berlin from the west. The Americans and British were crossing the Rhine almost unopposed. And in the center of it all, Adolf Hitler sat in a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed above ground. Berlin was burning. Artillery shells rained down around the clock. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble in minutes. Civilians hid in basements and subway tunnels, while soldiers deserted by the thousands. Some stripped off their uniforms and tried to blend in with the refugees. Others shot themselves rather than face what was coming. The roads leading west were clogged with people fleeing toward the American lines because everyone knew the same thing. Surrender to the Americans meant prison. Surrender to the Soviets meant something far worse. Generals were scrambling. Some fled west, hoping to negotiate deals. Others swallowed cyanide capsules in their command posts. A few simply vanished into the chaos, slipping away in the confusion of a collapsing empire. And in the middle of all of this, Karl Friedrich Brandt received his final orders. Defend a sector northeast of Berlin near the town of Eberswalde. Hold the line against the Soviet advance. The order was insane, and everyone knew it. Brandt's division barely existed on paper. What remained were old men pulled from factories and boys pulled from classrooms, handed outdated weapons and pointed toward the largest army ever assembled. They had no air support, no armor, and no chance. Brandt read the orders, looked at what was left of his command, and understood something with absolute clarity. This war was over. The only question left was how many more people had to die before someone admitted it. April 20th, 1945. The same day Adolf Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the bunker beneath Berlin. A junior officer named Lieutenant Werner Fisch reported seeing General Brandt at a forward command post near Eberswalde. It was late afternoon, and the sound of Soviet artillery was close enough to rattle the windows. Fisch later described the scene in detail. Brandt was standing over a map table, but he wasn't studying positions or planning counterattacks. He was calm, almost eerily composed, like a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act. What struck Fisch most was Brandt's uniform. It was clean-pressed, immaculate, in the middle of a war zone, where everyone else looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Brandt looked like he was preparing for an inspection. Then Brandt did something no one expected. He gathered his remaining officers and gave a single order. Any man still under his command was to lay down arms and surrender to the nearest advancing Allied unit. Do not fight. Do not resist. Do not throw away your life for something that's already finished. The officers stared at him, some relieved, some stunned. One reportedly began to cry. Brandt then removed his Iron Cross, the decoration he'd carried since the First World War, and handed it to his adjutant, a young captain named Graf. He looked at him and said 5 words that would haunt everyone who heard them. I have made arrangements. No one asked what he meant. By morning, Brandt was gone. His staff car was found abandoned on a narrow forest road east of Eberswalde. The engine was still warm. Maps were spread across the passenger seat. A half-empty canteen sat on the dashboard, but the general himself had vanished. No body, no note, no trail, no footprints leading into the trees. Just silence, and a car that was still running, as if its driver had simply stepped out of the world. When the Soviets swept through the forests northeast of Berlin in the final days of April 1945, they catalogued everything captured: officers, dead, soldiers, abandoned equipment, vehicles, weapons, entire command posts left behind in the rush to flee west. They were methodical, thorough, and relentless in documenting the collapse of the German military machine. But in all of those records, across thousands of pages of captured documents and prisoner lists, one name never appeared: Karl Friedrich Brandt. Allied intelligence ran their own searches. The Americans and British compiled extensive rosters of German officers who had surrendered, been captured, or been confirmed dead. Brandt was on none of them. He existed in a strange, bureaucratic void, a general who had simply ceased to exist somewhere between his last order and the morning after. Soviet and American investigators independently reached the same conclusion: presumed dead, likely killed in the final fighting, or buried in one of the countless unmarked graves that dotted the German countryside. The file was closed, stamped, and shelved. But 600 miles to the south, in a small village in Bavaria, a woman refused to accept that conclusion. Margaret Brandt had been evacuated from Berlin with her 3 children in early 1945. The last letter she received from her husband was dated April 12th, 8 days before he vanished. In it, he wrote about the garden they would plant after the war, about the books he wanted to read to the children, about a future he described as if he could see it clearly. When the war ended and Karl Friedrich didn't come home, Margaret began writing letters to the Red Cross, to Allied occupation authorities, to anyone who might have information. She wrote for years, dozens of letters sent into a system overwhelmed by millions of similar requests, from millions of similar families. The replies, when they came at all, were always the same. We have no information regarding the whereabouts of your husband. The children grew up with a ghost for a father, a man frozen in a day. Single photograph on the mantelpiece, in his dress uniform, unsmiling, steady, looking directly into the camera, as if he knew someone would be searching that face for answers decades later. Then the Cold War buried everything. The forests northeast of Berlin, where Brandt had vanished, fell behind the Iron Curtain, swallowed by the newly formed German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The entire region around Eberswalde and the Schorfheide forest was designated a restricted military zone, used by Soviet forces for training exercises and weapons testing. No civilians were allowed in, no questions were welcome, and no one from the West was getting anywhere near it. For Margareta, this was the cruelest blow. The very ground where her husband had last been seen was now locked behind barbed wire and border guards. She couldn't search, couldn't hire anyone to search, couldn't even visit. Her inquiries to East German authorities were met with silence or bureaucratic deflection. The Soviets had no interest in fighting his rule, helping a German widow find her missing Wehrmacht general, and the West German government had bigger problems than one man who vanished 10 years earlier. Brandt's name faded from history, one of roughly 1.3 million German soldiers listed as missing at the war's end, men who were never found, never identified, never buried with their names on the headstone, just gone, absorbed into the mathematics of industrialized war. His former comrades who survived either didn't know what happened to him or didn't want to talk about it. The war was something most people wanted to forget, not investigate. Margaret died in 1971, still waiting, still writing letters. Her oldest daughter, Elsa, inherited a cardboard box containing everything that remained of Karl Friedrich Brandt. Field journals tied with string, letters in fading ink, the leather wallet with family photographs that had somehow been returned through the Red Cross years after the war, and a single page torn from a book of poetry with a passage underlined in pencil about a man who walked into a forest and chose not to return. Elsa kept that box for over 50 years. She never stopped believing that her father had survived longer than anyone thought, that somewhere in those restricted forests behind the Iron Curtain, there was an answer no one had been allowed to find. And in 2025, at the age of 88, she would finally be proven right. Matthias Erdmann had been a forestry surveyor for 14 years. He'd walked more of Brandenburg's woodlands than most people knew existed, mapping root systems, cataloging soil erosion, assessing tree health for the state government. It was quiet work, methodical, the kind of job where the most exciting thing that happens in a week is finding a deer carcass or an old Soviet ammunition casing rusting in the dirt. Spring 2025. He was contracted to survey a dense stretch of forest near the Schorfheide Koren Biosphere Reserve, one of the largest protected woodland areas in Germany. The area had been largely untouched since reunification. In 1990, before that it had been a Soviet military zone, and before that a private hunting reserve used by senior Nazi officials, including Hermann Göring himself. Layers of history stacked on top of each other, all buried under 80 years of beech trees and undergrowth. Erdmann wasn't looking for history. He was looking for root damage. But on April 3, 2025, his ground-penetrating radar started showing something strange. The screen lit up with anomalies, geometric shapes, straight lines, right angles, things that don't occur naturally in forest soil. At first he assumed it was old Soviet infrastructure, a collapsed storage facility, or a buried equipment depot. The area was full of Cold War debris, but the deeper his equipment scanned, the more complex the shapes became. This wasn't random debris. This was structure. Erdmann marked the coordinates and came back the next day with a shovel and a colleague. 2 feet below the surface, they hit concrete. Not crumbled, not degraded, but solid, reinforced concrete. The kind used in military construction. He brushed away the dirt and saw the edge of a wall, then a corner, then what appeared to be a door frame leading downward into the earth. Erdmann stopped digging, pulled out his phone, and called his supervisor. "Something is down here," he said. "I think you need to send someone." Within 48 hours, the site was cordoned off. Brandenburg State Police arrived first, followed by a team from the Landesamt für Denkmalpflege, the State Office for Historic Preservation, and then military historians from the Bundeswehr Center for Military History in Potsdam. What Matthias Erdmann had stumbled onto wasn't a Soviet storage bunker or a collapsed ammunition depot. It was something no one had expected to find beneath a thick canopy of beech trees whose roots had spent 8 decades wrapping themselves around concrete walls. A network of partially collapsed structures emerged from the forest floor. The main structure was a bunker, roughly 12 feet by 16 feet, with reinforced concrete walls. Nearly 2 feet thick, a heavy iron door hung off its hinges, half consumed by rust, but still recognizable as a blast-rated entrance. 2 smaller outbuildings sat nearby. One appeared to have been used for storage, the other possibly as a latrine or secondary shelter. But it was the details that told the real story. This wasn't something thrown together in desperation. A hand-dug well, lined with stones, sat 30 feet from the main bunker, still holding groundwater. Ventilation shafts ran upward through the soil, disguised at the surface as tree stumps so convincingly that Erdmann had walked past them twice without noticing. Drainage channels had been cut into the concrete floor to prevent flooding. Whoever built this compound understood construction, understood concealment, and understood that they might be here for a very long time. This wasn't a foxhole or a hiding spot dug in panic during the war's final hours. This was a planned, deliberate retreat, built by someone with military engineering knowledge and access to materials someone who had no intention of being found. Archaeologists began the slow, careful process of excavating the interior, and what they pulled out of that bunker would stun everyone who saw it, because it didn't just contain supplies, it contained a life. When archaeologists finally cleared the entrance and stepped inside the bunker for the first time, they described the experience as walking into a room where time had simply stopped. Everything was exactly where someone had left it, decades ago, untouched, undisturbed, preserved by the cool, dry conditions of the underground space, like a tomb that no one knew existed. A rusted iron cot sat against the far wall, a thin mattress long since decomposed into a dark stain on the metal frame. Beside it, a kerosene stove still holding the blackened remnants of its last fuel. Shelves had been carved directly into the concrete walls, and on them sat rows of corroded tin cans, military ration containers, their labels eaten away by moisture, but their contents still sealed inside. Some of them, a woolen blanket, folded with military precision, sat on the cot, as if its owner had made the bed one final time before leaving. But it was the other side of the bunker that made the historians go quiet. A wooden desk, handmade from what appeared to be local timber, sat beneath one of the ventilation shafts, positioned to catch whatever light filtered down from the surface. On the desk, a stack of mildewed books, philosophy, Schopenhauer, Goethe, agricultural manuals, poetry collections. And beside them, a kerosene lantern, its glass chimney cracked but intact. Inside the desk drawer, they found what they had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Personal documents, military identification papers, a leather wallet containing family photographs, 3 children, and a woman standing in a garden, squinting against the sun, and a journal bound in dark leather. The name on the military papers was unmistakable: General Major Karl Friedrich Brandt. The photographs were cross-referenced with existing Wehrmacht personnel records, and they matched perfectly after 80 years. The missing general had been found not in a battlefield grave, not in an unmarked pit, but in a bunker he had built for himself, buried in a forest less than 60 miles from where he was last seen alive. The journal was the find that changed everything. The books, the rations, the cot, those told you someone had lived here. But the journal told you who he was and why he stayed. It was written in a meticulous, precise hand, the kind of penmanship drilled into Prussian officers from childhood. Every entry dated, every page numbered. The ink had faded in places, and moisture had blurred some passages beyond recovery, but the bulk of it was legible, and what it contained was extraordinary. The first entry was dated April 21st, 1945, the day after Brandt's last known sighting at Eberswalde. He wrote simply, "I have left. God forgive me. The war is over, but the dying is not, and I will not add to it." In the entries that followed, he described his decision to desert, not with shame, but with a quiet certainty that unsettled even the historians reading it 80 years later. He hadn't run out of fear. He had walked away out of refusal. A refusal to spend one more life on a cause he had stopped believing in years before the war ended. He detailed the construction of the compound built over the winter of 1944 and early 1945 with the help of 2 trusted soldiers, engineers from his division, whose names he never recorded to protect them. They had stockpiled materials, concrete bags, iron sheeting, rations, diverting supplies through military channels that were already collapsing into chaos. Once the compound was finished, the 2 men disappeared into the flood of refugees heading west. Brandt never heard from them again. The middle entries are the most haunting. He writes about lying in the dark, listening to Soviet convoys rumble past on roads less than a kilometer away, about rationing food so carefully that he knew the caloric value of every tin, about the silence of the forest, how it pressed against him at night, like something physical, how it became both his prison and his sanctuary. Then, slowly, the entries begin to change. The handwriting loosens, the dates become irregular. The reflections grow longer, more philosophical, more fragmented. He writes about guilt, about his children, about whether disappearing was an act of courage or the worst kind of cowardice. One entry simply reads, "The trees do not judge me, but I judge myself every hour." The final entries are barely coherent, and then they stop. Once the initial shock of the discovery faded, the real work began. Piecing together how long Carl Friedrich Brandt had actually survived in that bunker, and what ultimately killed him. Military historians and forensic analysts spent weeks examining every detail of the compound, cataloging every item, dating every artifact, building a timeline from the physical evidence left behind. The picture that emerged was remarkable. Brandt hadn't improvised this in the final hours of the war. He had planned it months in advance, using the chaos of a collapsing military logistics system to divert supplies without raising suspicion. Concrete bags marked for fortification projects that never existed. Ration crates rerouted from supply depots that were already losing track of their inventory. Medical supplies, kerosene, fuel, woolen blankets, all funneled quietly into the forest by men who understood that the war was ending and that their general was offering them something rare, a chance to stop fighting before the fighting stopped them. The compound itself was built in stages during the brutal winter of 1944 and early 1945. Forensic analysis of the concrete confirmed it was consistent with military-grade materials available during that period. The engineering was sound: ventilation, drainage, insulation. This was built by professionals, working quickly but carefully, under conditions that would have been extraordinarily dangerous. Discovery by the SS or military police would have meant execution for desertion. But the real question was, how long did he last? The journal provided the clearest answer. The entries span from April 21, 1945, to what forensic document analysts estimated was late 1947, or possibly early 1948. Roughly 2.5 to 3 years of solitary existence in an underground bunker. The early entries show discipline, rationing schedules, supply inventories, a man managing his survival with military precision. The later entries show something else entirely: isolation, loneliness, a mind turning inward with no one to talk to and nothing to do but think. Then the journal simply stops. No final entry, no farewell, no explanation, just silence. The last few pages are blank, as if he had intended to write more, but never did. Skeletal remains found on the cot were carefully collected and sent to the Institute of Legal Medicine in Berlin for DNA analysis. The bones showed no signs of trauma, no fractures, no footnotes, bullet wounds, whatever killed Carl Friedrich Brandt. It wasn't violence. It was something quieter than that. The DNA extraction took 3 weeks. The remains had been underground for nearly 8 decades, and while the cool, dry conditions of the bunker had preserved them better than an open grave, the process was still painstaking. Forensic geneticists at the Institute of Legal Medicine in Berlin worked carefully, extracting viable samples from dental material and comparing them against a reference profile. They still needed a living descendant to confirm the match. That's where Elsa Brandt came in. She was 88 years old, living in a quiet apartment in Munich, surrounded by books and photographs, and the same cardboard box she had kept for over 50 years. The box her mother had left her, containing her father's field journals, his letters, his poetry, and that single, underlined passage about a man who walked into a forest and chose not to return. When investigators contacted her, she agreed to provide a DNA sample immediately, without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for this phone call her entire life. The results came back on a Tuesday in June 2025. The match was conclusive. The remains found in the bunker in the Schorfheide forest were those of Generalmajor Karl Friedrich Brandt. The news was delivered to Elsa by phone by a detective from the Brandenburg State Police, who later said it was the most difficult call he had ever made. Elsa was silent for a long time. The detective thought the line had gone dead. Then she spoke quietly, steadily, with a voice that carried 80 years of waiting. "I always knew he didn't just disappear. He was somewhere. He was always somewhere. I told my mother that when I was a little girl. I told everyone. No one believed me." She paused. "Now they know." The discovery became international news. Within hours, German media ran it first. Then it spread across Europe, to the UK, to the United States. The story of a Wehrmacht general who built himself a bunker in the forest and vanished for 80 years captured something that went beyond military history. It was a human story, a story about choices. Historians began reassessing Brandt's record, not as a war criminal fleeing justice, not as a coward running from duty, but as a man who, in the final hours of a collapsing empire, chose to stop, chose to walk away, and chose to disappear rather than participate in one more day of destruction. Not everyone saw Karl Friedrich Brandt as a tragic figure, and the backlash came fast. Within days of the story breaking, historians, military analysts, and commentators began picking apart the narrative that had captured the world's imagination. The romantic version was appealing. A disillusioned general who walked away from the war, built a bunker in the forest, and disappeared rather than participate in more killing. But history is rarely that clean, and Brandt's record wasn't either. His division had served on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1943, some of the most brutal years of the most brutal theater of the entire war. And while Brandt was widely regarded as a competent and even humane commander by the standards of the Wehrmacht, that phrase, "by the standards of the Wehrmacht," did a lot of heavy lifting. Critics pointed out that serving on the Eastern Front meant operating in proximity to atrocities that were systematic and well documented. The question wasn't whether Brandt had personally committed war crimes. The question was what he saw, what he knew, and what he chose to do about it. Some historians argued he was being romanticized, that deserting in April 1945, when the war was already lost, didn't make someone a resistor. It made them a pragmatist, a man who read the situation and saved himself, while millions of others didn't have that option. One German military historian put it bluntly, "He didn't resist the war, he outlasted it. There's a difference." Others pushed back, pointing to the journal entries as evidence of genuine moral struggle. A man who wrestled with guilt, who questioned his own choices, who ordered his men to surrender rather than die in a meaningless last stand. They argued Brandt existed in the gray space where most people in wartime actually live, not as heroes, not as villains, but as human beings making impossible decisions with incomplete information. The debate forced uncomfortable questions that went far beyond one missing general. How do we remember the war? Who gets to be called brave? Who gets forgiven? And who decides where the line falls between obedience and complicity? The answers depended entirely on who you asked, and 80 years later, no one could agree. By autumn 2025, the excavation was complete. Every artifact had been catalogued, photographed, and removed for preservation. The journal was transferred to the German Federal Archives in Koblenz. The military papers and personal effects were offered to Elsa Brandt, who accepted them quietly adding them to the cardboard box she had carried for half a century. The bunker itself was documented down to the 7mm with laser scanning and photogrammetry, creating a digital record of every crack, every shelf, every scratch on the concrete walls. Then came the question no one could easily answer: what to do with the site itself. The Brandenburg state government convened a panel of historians, preservationists, and local officials to debate the options. Some argued the compound should be preserved as a historical site, opened to researchers and eventually the public, a physical testament to the impossible choices people made during the war's final days. Others said it should be sealed and left alone, that turning it into a destination would risk glorifying desertion, or worse, creating a pilgrimage site for the wrong kind of admiration. In the end, they chose a middle path. The bunker entrances were sealed with steel plates, the outbuildings were left as they were, and a small memorial marker was placed at the edge of the site. A simple stone with Brandt's name, his birth, and estimated death years, and nothing else. No rank, no title, no explanation, just a name in a forest. The beech trees that had grown over the compound were left standing. They were towering now, 80 feet tall. Their roots had spent decades cracking through the concrete walls, pushing through ventilation shafts, wrapping around iron supports like slow, patient fingers, reclaiming the space inch by inch. Nature had been erasing Carl Friedrich Brandt's hiding place since the day he built it, indifferent to his story, indifferent to the debate, indifferent to everything except the simple work of growing. Elsa visited once in late October, accompanied by her grandson, a man in his 30s who held her arm as they walked the narrow forest path to the marker. She stood there for several minutes, looking at the trees, the sealed entrance, the stone with her father's name. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a photograph, the same one from the mantelpiece. The general, in his dress uniform, unsmiling, steady, looking directly into the camera. She placed it against the base of the marker and turned away without speaking. Her grandson asked if she was all right. She said, "He's home now." And they walked back through the trees. Carl Friedrich Brandt was not a hero in any traditional sense. He didn't lead a resistance. He didn't save thousands. He didn't stand in front of a firing squad and deliver a speech that would be quoted in textbooks for generations. He was a man who reached a breaking point, and instead of pushing through it, he stepped sideways into the trees and let the world forget him. But his story isn't really about one missing general. It's about the choices people make when everything around them is collapsing, when the rules stop making sense, and the orders coming down from above will get everyone killed. What do you do when obedience means death, and resistance means death, and the only door left is the one no one is watching? Do you walk through it, or do you stay and die with everyone else? For 80 years, Carl Friedrich Brandt lived and died within earshot of a world that moved on without him. Soviet convoys passed within a kilometer of his bunker. East German soldiers trained in the forests above his head. Hikers walked trails that ran within a few hundred meters of his sealed door. And no one ever knew he was there. A man who had commanded thousands of soldiers, who had dined with field marshals and briefed generals, disappeared so completely that even the earth swallowed him. He chose silence over surrender, solitude over spectacle. He traded a world at war for a concrete room and a kerosene lantern, and the slow company of his own thoughts. Whether that makes him brave or broken depends entirely on what you believe about duty, about survival, and about the cost of conscience. There is no clean answer, and maybe that's the point. The forest kept his secret for 8 decades. The roots grew over his walls. The trees sealed his ventilation shafts. The soil buried his door. And the world above carried on, building new countries, new borders, new wars, new reasons to forget the last one, until a man with a radar scanner walked into the wrong stretch of woodland and found what was never meant to be found. Now the story has been told, the bunker is sealed, the journal is archived, and Elsa Brandt can finally stop waiting. But here's the thing that stays with you long after the details fade. 1.3 million German soldiers were listed as missing at the end of the Second World War. Most were lost on battlefields or in prisoner of war camps or in the chaos of collapse. But some of them just disappeared, walked into forests, crossed mountains, vanished into the spaces between history's records. Karl Friedrich Brandt was one of them, and they found him by accident 80 years later. Which raises the only question that really matters. How many others are still out there, hidden beneath the roots, buried under decades of silence, waiting to be found? Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night, when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes. Your mood suffers. Everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk. Nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 30-Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night, 7 to 8 hours, uninterrupted. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system. And once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan, so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. Check the link in the description. Seriously, try it. And I'll catch you in the next story.